everybody. It's Kim West on the Gentle Parenting Show. And in today's episode, I'm so honored to have my colleague, Dr. Roseann Capanna-Hodge. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her because, boy, is she an accomplished woman. She's a mental health trailblazer. She's the founder of the Global Institute of Children's Mental Health and a media expert who's changing the way we view and treat children's mental health. Her work has helped thousands reverse the most challenging conditions: ADHD, anxiety, mood, Lyme's disease, PANDAS, using proven holistic therapies. She's often featured on dozens of media outlets, and she's the author of this book, It's Gonna Be Okay, which is an incredible resource. So thank you so much, Dr. Roseann. There are so many things that we've already decided that we're going to have you come back and talk about, but we're going to narrow today talking about the difference between stress and anxiety, because boy, do we hear a lot about our children nowadays of all ages having way more anxiety than I ever have heard about before. And it's hard for us to know as parents. What is it? Is it stress from what's going on in their world, in their school, in their social life, or is it true anxiety where they need, more help?
Yeah. And, here's one of the things that I've seen, Kim, in this 30th year that I'm in mental health is that how did that
Amazing.
happen, Kim? How did we get into,
I don't
mental
know.
health so long? But I'm glad that I'm here and I have no plans to retire. I always tell my clients, like, I'll still be here when I'm in my 70s. So don't worry about it. Right. And my dad is just retiring in his job as an entrepreneur. And he's not really retiring, but in his 80s. So,
Wow.
he's having a hard time stopping going to work. It's pretty cute. But here's what's happened in these 30 years. Stress and anxiety is absolutely skyrocketing for kids of all ages, even very young kids, Kim.
Yeah.
And, parents often come to me and they're like, how could my 3-year-old be anxious?
Yeah.
And or 9-year-old, we live in a nice house, we go to a good school, and he or she's got good friends. It's happening, and it's happening for a
Yeah.
lot of reasons, and I dive into a lot of those reasons and what you can do about it in my book, It's Going to Be Okay. But ultimately, there is a convergence of issues happening at the same time, and it is things like we're changing genetically, we have genetic mutations, we have poor food quality, the actual quality of our food. We don't have the same level of nutrients in our food. Kids are sleeping less. There's an impact of technology. And, really ultimately, not to make parents feel bad, because I've done this too, parents are on the worry train and they're over parenting their kids because
Mm.
everybody's over parenting their kids. And what does that mean? It means that kids
Yeah.
are not learning how to tolerate and experience things that are not great. They're not used to
Mhm.
feeling uncomfortable emotions. They're not used to not getting their way. And, what we saw in this
Mhm.
time of the pandemic is that kids really kind of fell apart, and so did their parents. But kids today, bottom line, are lacking coping skills. They
Mm.
don't have resilience and grit. And so what that means is that even though our stressors are greater, I want to say that that is true. Kids
Mhm.
today have a lot more stressors. There's not the same kind of downtime. Like, I'm sure you and I, we were out playing,
Yep. Yep.
right? I
Mhm.
wasn't overscheduled.
Nope. Right.
And I got to do a lot of really fun stuff, even during the week. It wasn't
Right.
just on the weekend.
Yeah.
We weren't as serious with our academics. And,
Right.
hello, I think I did okay.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. I think we
right.
were under supervised and under scheduled.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe, I mean, it worked well for me too.
It worked.
But
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I learned how to be really independent. My parents
Hmm.
were, even then in the 70s and 80s, were different from the other parents. Like, I'm the daughter of Italian immigrants. And so my parents were, their style of parenting is probably very much like mine. Were really into autonomy, supportive parenting. So they had clear limits. And
Yeah.
there were things that I knew I never could do. You know what I mean? Like, my parents were like, if you get arrested for drugs, like, we're literally leaving you in the jail. right? And let me tell you something.
Right.
I knew that to be true.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know how sometimes your
Yeah.
parents say things, I was like,
Uh-huh.
okay, that's a boundary. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, and then there were other things, like they were like, you know, if I got in trouble for punching a kid for being rude, they'd be like, thank goodness you punched that kid in the face. You know what I mean? So like
Right.
they had different kinds of bound. I'm not recommending that, mom and dad.
Right.
Okay. But they were really let us kind of spread our wings. And we also did pack play where we were in a pack with multi-age kids, and there was safety in that. We were allowed to do that. Today kids don't necessarily, there are communities across America where kids can kind of play in groups. It's just not as common as it used to be, right? And
Yeah.
so what happens there is kids get to watch other kids, they get to learn how to negotiate, they also get to test their limits of comfortableness and autonomy, and they have to figure things out and work things out without their parents supervising them. You know, in my case, I always had an older brother there, you know, 5 years older than me. So, you know, I always knew that he would protect me and I wasn't gonna, you know, when my neighbor, John threw me in the hedges, you know.
Oh, I had two brothers. I know all about these things.
Yeah, but my brother came to my back and like was like,
Mhm.
"No, you don't get to throw my sister in the hedges." You know what I mean? And that
Mhm.
was the last time that happened. But so, you know, what's happening
Love
to
it.
kids? Or what's happening with stress? What's happening anxiety? Okay, pre-pandemic, we already knew our kids were at a very, very high distress point. It's why I founded the Global Institute of Children's Mental Health in January of 2020, right before the pandemic, because I was like, we've got a lot going on. I need to educate parents about how to change this, how to reverse these symptoms using science-backed natural therapies, techniques, methods, because parents, they just don't know the impact often until those behaviors really move from stress to anxiety. And it's just a lot easier to deal with things with kids when it's in the early stages, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, you know, kids today really are much more anxious. We know this through research. The average age of onset of an anxiety disorder is age 6, Kim.
Yeah.
Age
Wow.
6.
Yeah.
So, you know, it
Mhm.
takes 11 years
Mhm.
from the onset of a problem, a mental health problem, before somebody gets appropriate help. And that's according to NAMI in 2019. Yep.
So
Yep.
17, a
Yeah.
teenager.
So it takes 11 years. Right. Exactly.
Wow.
On average.
Mhm.
So there are many times people come to me with somebody who's 25 and they
Right.
say, you know, my kid is struggling and I'm realizing it started when they were 2 or 3, but they were a
Right.
good student.
Right.
And so I didn't really make the connection that it really was a
Mhm.
clinical issue. I, you know, scream it from
Mhm.
the rooftops. Like, you can be a
Mhm.
straight A student
Mhm.
and be suicidal, be depressed,
Yeah.
have OCD.
Mhm.
Um, that does not mean just like functional adults, right? You know what
Right.
I mean?
Yep.
And we can't use that as a benchmark for mental health, and we do,
Mhm. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. And it's pretty scary. So I think the thing that parents always ask me, or you know, people always ask me, like, what are the signs, right?
Mhm.
And to understand what stress is and what anxiety is, really, really, really clear. So the symptoms start out the same, right? But ultimately, anxiety is when you have an issue, a behavior, or set of behaviors that interfere in your daily life. And so,
Mhm.
for a child, a teenager, a young adult, it means that it's interfering getting along with siblings, or getting along with parents or peers, or it's interfering with your learning in some way, right?
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
obviously emotional and behavioral regulation, right?
Mhm.
So, and, you know, when we think about stress, I mentioned the 3-year-old who's struggling. Most parents aren't connecting the behaviors that they see as red flags, right? And we have a lot of grace with our little kids, right? You
Mhm.
know, sometimes parents come to me and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't keep, you know, he won't stop hitting his sister. Does this mean he's going to be a serial killer?" No.
Thank goodness.
But we got to teach them to, have happy hands, you know what I mean? To
Mhm.
not be touching people. So, stress is a normal response, right? So we have a system that's designed to manage stress. It's called our autonomic nervous system. And in our autonomic nervous system, we have a relaxed state called a parasympathetic state, and then we have a stress state called sympathetic dominant. And the more we do to help our nervous system be calm, you go into a parasympathetic state. So, what does that mean, Roseann? It means like we do breath work, we do meditation, we do yoga, we do prayer, we do
Mhm.
positive affirmations, we walk, we do things that calm our nervous system, we do good sleep,
Mhm.
right? Good sleep is one of the best ways to actually stress inoculate your kids and keep their nervous system nice and regulated. Super, super, super important, right? I talk a lot about sleep in the book because it's one of those foundational things that we think is outside of our control, right? But
Mhm.
we always have an ability to help our kids when they're living in our house.
Yeah.
And sleep just has to be a priority, right? So
Here,
we,
here.
right?
Yeah.
Amen, right? So when we have a stress response, our system is, it should be regulated. We're not. We're in the, right now people are not regulated, but don't worry about it. Good news, we can get it down. You just have to really be intentful and
Mhm.
do the work, and you just need as little as 10 minutes a day. But something happens to your kid, like, the brother smacks the kid, right? I'm always going to the sibling stuff because
Mhm. It's
my kids
common.
on the boat last night, it was like the teenager in my house is the one that has problems with impulse control, and the younger one does
Mhm.
not. So
Mhm.
they try to get together, and the
Mhm.
teenager is like hanging on them and try to push him off the thing or whatever, and we sat him down
Right.
and they worked it out, and it was very cute. But that's kind of, you have a kid that's a little more handsy, right?
Mhm.
And have a harder time putting on the brakes. They just need extra TLC and support and structure around it. So, your sibling smacks another sibling, one kid goes into the sympathetic dominant stressed out state. Well, if they have a normal nervous system, it comes back down, right?
Mhm.
The stressor goes away. But what's happening is kids are living in this sympathetic dominant stressed out state. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? It means that their nervous system is literally it could potentially be in a fight, flight, or freeze mode all the time. It's always activated, it's always looking for a potential threat, is really what happens. And we can't live there. And a lot of adults are living there, right? And your
Mhm.
body knows no difference between good and bad stress.
Mhm.
And your kid could be preparing for graduation and be falling apart, mental health wise, because of
Mhm.
just the stressors, having to
Mhm.
complete college applications and look at this, and then people
Mhm.
asking them every day what college you're going to go to. I mean, it's one of the most stressful things kids will tell you that they
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And it's a happy time, right?
Yeah. Right.
And it's so stressful. So what happens is you're such a stress hyperactivated state, and eventually, there's going to be a physical or a mental health ramification. There's no way around it. You
Mhm.
can't outwit stress. You have to pull
Mhm.
it back and take care of yourself.
Mhm.
So then what becomes the difference between stress, chronic stress, and clinical anxiety? Clinical anxiety, again, is something is interfering with your daily life. It's a constant. Your child is maybe on the anxiety continuum or stress continuum or any clinical issue. It presents itself along continuum from internalizers to externalizers. So our
Mhm.
internalizers are kind of what we think about somebody who's anxious, right? Somebody who's worried. They ask worried questions. Mom, is my
Yeah.
homework in my bag? Are
Right.
you going to wait in the room while I go to sleep? Right?
Right.
One of the biggest signs of anxiety is stuff around sleep. And we'll go through some of the
Mhm.
signs.
Mhm.
And then on the externalizer side are people that you miss as having anxiety, but they can be kids, teens with rage, it really angry talk, violent talk, aggressive behaviors towards themselves or others. And then in
Mhm.
between is sort of everything that you could think of, right? So we can
Mhm.
have a kid who's really emotional in the middle. We can have a kid that's afraid to take risks. So you've got a really bright kid, but they're always the kid you have to coax into going down the slide, or, talking to a new person and those kind of things. And that's a continuum of what anxiety can look like. And, again, there's an impact in one or more areas, but most people with clinical anxiety, adults included, are functioning, right? And they can be functioning pretty well, particularly kids at school, because
Mm-hmm.
there's structure and routine. There's
Mm-hmm.
the impact of the peers and wanting to please, right? A lot of our anxious people are people pleasers. And, so they'll just keep going,
Right.
going. And then at home, as I like to say, they could be a hot mess, right?
Right.
Right.
Yep.
um,
Yeah.
and then where do these behaviors show up? Like, what does stress look like? What does anxiety look like? Again, they overlap. Those symptoms
Yep.
can be very similar, except clinical
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, the level of interfering in their daily life is much, much higher. That's why it's clinical anxiety. And again,
Mm-hmm.
you can have a 3-year-old who is literally experiencing
Mm-hmm.
clinical anxiety, and
Mm-hmm.
and there can be, we talked about some of the reasons. So you might have a really highly sensitive kid, and in this
Mm-hmm.
time when everybody is so anxious, they are so, as I'm calling it, viperish.
Mm.
And in the beginning of the pandemic, I was talking about reentry panic because people were panicking. Then I started
Mm-hmm.
talking about reentry anxiety. Now I'm talking about reentry socialization. Like, I
Yeah.
feel like, are you seeing this, Kim?
I mean, I see it even in my life. I'm like, is this the way our life was before? Like 200 miles an hour? Like, I feel like we all need like reentry therapy.
Right. And
Yeah.
and some people are reentering. I think people just forgot their manners in the pandemic.
Yes. Low, no filters. Right.
Holy moly. Like,
Yeah.
I'm really kind of shocked of how people
Yeah.
act.
Yeah.
So my motto is, you can never go wrong by doing the right thing, and
Mm-hmm.
you absolutely should always go out of your way to be nice to people. You just never know what's going on with somebody. You
Right.
just don't.
Right. Yeah.
And I just like that feeling of being nice to somebody and then somebody smiling at me, and all that releases all this awesome brain chemicals.
Yeah.
So kids in the world, as they're re-entering, and everyone else, your kid may have their stuff together and really thrived in the pandemic. They're
Yeah.
re-entering the world with people that have not gotten it together. And if you
Right.
have a sensitive kid, I was a kid who was an empath. My kids are empaths. They
Yeah.
pick up. And I have one kid who's just like
Mm-hmm.
me. He knows to move away and stay away from people that don't have it together. And I have another
Mm-hmm.
kid who is an absorber. So he
Right.
all of a sudden takes it on. He doesn't even know what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and he can't distinguish between it. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you just see a behavioral kind of overflow from him. Like, he might
Mm-hmm.
be a little hyper, he might be this. It's really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. And I support, I work with people remotely and in person in my center. And I see this a lot. This is really sort of common with kids.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and if you are at all an empath as an adult, trust me, at least one of your kids is going to be an empath. It's just the
Yep.
way that it is, and it's not a bad
Yep.
thing. You have it's one of my superpowers, right, Kim?
Yeah. Yeah. But we do have to teach our children. I always say how to like filter some of it out,
Yes.
to preserve themselves.
A
Mm-hmm.
100%. And I think the first point of it is to actually have a conversation. So, like, my kids are very aware of their ability to pick up energy and have feelings. And I teach,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my work is about teaching people to connect to the body and
Mm-hmm.
understanding what the signals are, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, if I'm around somebody, and my parents actually really taught me a lot. Like, if I'm around somebody, and I've gotten myself out of some dangerous situations as a young woman, teenager,
Mm-hmm.
young adult,
Mm-hmm.
because my system was like, this is a dangerous situation. This is a bad person. I'm not saying I was like doing anything wrong, but sometimes,
Right.
you're in a place where you're like, this doesn't feel right. And so the
Mm-hmm.
best thing my parents did is they always taught me to pay attention to the signals that my body was
Mm-hmm.
telling me. If it didn't feel right, don't ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a pillar and an anchor in mental health, Kim, because what happens when
Mm-hmm.
our kids are anxious or stressed? And if we are anxious and stressed, we want to disconnect. We want to scroll on our phone. We want
Mm-hmm.
to binge watch Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that's okay, not okay once in a while, but when we regularly disconnect, it becomes harder to reconnect. And
Mm-hmm.
those cueing signals are there for us to say, oh, this feels like grief. Oh, this feels like worry. Oh, this feels like this. And then we take a minute, we process it, we address it. And when our
Yeah.
kids have those skills, they literally become so much more stress inoculated. They understand things differently. They just don't view stress in the same way because their alert system is working. But when our alert system isn't working, anything that feels like it's a point of distress, we
Mm-hmm.
want to disconnect. And and I know that it sounds counterintuitive, but it is really the opposite of what you want to do. The more your kid disconnects from emotions and feelings, the less likely they're going to be successful in school, the less likely they're going to be a leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're
Mm-hmm.
all so hung up on our kids getting into these great schools, but that doesn't mean they're going to be a leader or really even have a high income, right? If they
Mm-hmm.
don't have good self-awareness, great
Mm-hmm.
social emotional connection, I'm telling you, your kid will be plagued with high levels of stress and potentially clinical issues. And clinical issues are really common. In 2011 data says that 54.2% of children, one in two children, have a physical or mental health problem in America.
Wow.
So one in, you got two kids, one of them's going to have some. So
Mm-hmm.
let's back it up, right? And that's what I do in my book. It's going to be okay. I literally give you all the pillars to reduce and reverse mental health symptoms. And this is directed towards parents, but these are the same pillars of mental health for adults as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we have so much power in what we can do as parents, and we're working so hard, Kim,
Yeah.
as parents. And I always talk about working harder, not working harder and working smarter,
Mm-hmm.
because we get on this worry train with our kids, and some of it's real legitimate. Like
Mm-hmm.
1 in 37 births is a kid with autism now,
Yeah.
and it's supposed to go up to 1 in 4 in 20 years,
Yeah.
right? So that's really scary stuff. But when we give our power away to that worry and we just say, "Oh, here's the worry," we don't actually change anything. And there's just so much we can do as parents to really support our own mental health, our kids' mental health. And I just, not because you and I are mental health providers, licensed mental health providers, but truly, if you don't have good mental health, like really, what do you have? And I think that became one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is that people said, you know what, I've been struggling with X, Y, and Z, and now I'm going to get help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. It was our opportunity to go inward. If some of us just had to, right, as a way to
Yeah.
cope. So since not all, but a lot of my listeners have younger children, maybe 10 and under. And I love everything that you're saying because I think it's so. I just like, as a side note, but it's connected. I really like using, even though I know some people say it doesn't work for all children, a hug hold instead of time out. And then as they get older, talking about the emotion afterwards, putting a name to it, talking about, wow, you were really angry when mommy said no. What are some other things you could do besides like hit somebody or hit me or bang your head on the floor? Could you scream in a pillow? Could you stamp your feet? Could you say I'm angry? Because it's that beginning of it's okay to have feelings and move through that. Because I think all of that also ends up applying to getting yourself to sleep, which is another form of self-regulation,
Self
right?
regulation.
How to slow down your body, how to shut off your mind. So how early do you think, and maybe I should back up a little bit. So some of the things I'm hearing you saying is for parents to listen to their own intuition and to encourage our children to listen to their bodies and their intuition. So tell us, like, how early could we start doing that, and how would that be with a really little kid? Because it sounds like it would be easier to figure out with an older child, like a teenager. But how about the younger kids?
You literally, Kim, can start this kind of conversation from day one. And, our kids truly are sponges, and
Mm-hmm.
they watch what you do, they listen to what you say less than
Mm-hmm.
what they watch what you do.
Yeah.
So, our subconscious is in charge 95 to 99.5% of the time. So
Yeah.
it's running the show. So what does that mean? That your kid is absorbing everything. They are absorbing your facial expressions. They are absorbing when you talk to them and you discipline them. Do you look like a jail warden, or do you have a loving expression to teach? Right?
Yeah.
I'm telling you, we know this through research, there is
Mm-hmm.
absolute impact on your child in every facet of your body language and how you deliver a message, from the words you use, the number of words you use, everything is there. And you literally, don't be overwhelmed by that, people. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I teach people this kind of stuff all the time, and it's really an opportunity. And here's what I want to say: when we start young, it's so much easier. And, I have two very different kids. Most people, their kids' personalities are really different. And my older son, Max, got Lyme disease at 22 months
Mm.
in
Oh.
PANS, and he's doing great.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you, at 16, he's the easiest I've ever had him, including
Mm-hmm.
as an infant. He's
Wow.
also intellectually gifted, which I know sounds really cool, but it means they're a pain in the butt. Okay.
Right.
So
They're harder to parent.
oh my God, they're so much harder to parent, and
Yeah.
they make connections when they shouldn't, and they get
Mm-hmm.
emotional about things because they understand things at a deeper level. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just not easy, right?
Yeah.
So I started, obviously I'm a therapist, but you don't have to be a therapist to do this. And it started in the beginning, right? So like when my kids were little, I would validate and be like, wow, that's really hard for you. Yeah, mommy. Okay. So that's upsetting. And I do things like touch where it bothers you. And so then
Mm-hmm.
my kids would start understanding their cueing system. And I didn't have to instruct them when they were 10. Sometimes I'd have to give them a little bit of a cue, but it didn't have to be a 10 to 30 minute 10 to 30 minute conversation. I would be like, check in with, where does it bother you? Okay. And then we really emphasize coping skills. And I love, Kim, that you want to do a hug instead of a timeout.
Right.
Our kids, I believe every clinical disorder is about brain dysregulation, because that's what the research says. And that's why I do
Mm-hmm.
all this neurofeedback with people all over the world, because it gets them brain to regulate. And when our nervous system is regulated, we can actually be open to learning. If we
Mm-hmm.
are dysregulated, we cannot be open to learning. And that's my magic sauce. That's why people come
Mm-hmm.
to me, because I
Mm-hmm.
use all these clinical technologies like neurofeedback and biofeedback to regulate the nervous system and then come in with new learning. And so when we have young kids, it's new learning. So get
Mm-hmm.
them, not when they're a hot mess, not when they're
Right.
tantruming, but get them to connect to the sensation, put
Mm-hmm.
words to it, which is
Mm-hmm.
emotions, right? When we try to come in with emotions first, this is not what kids understand.
Right.
They need to understand things through the body, right? We have to take a bottoms up approach, right? Kids are
Mm-hmm.
very physical, right? And so it's an opportunity for them to learn. It helps you later in life, it helps them right now. And when I mean it helps you later in life, it just becomes easier to parent. Like, truly, my kid at 16, we can have much easier conversations about things than, he was a kid that needed a lot of extra practice. And you
Mm-hmm.
have to start thinking about things as practice. And, when you start to understand that your kid is literally watching everything you do,
Mm-hmm.
it's really like, holy moly, I've got to get my stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of why in our household, Kim, Mr. Hodge and I are super playful people. We use a lot of humor to diffuse situations. It doesn't mean we minimize situations, but our kids are used to that style, and it helps to get our kids to be more autonomous and do things on their own. You really want your kids regulating on their own, and it's going to show up in their behavior, it's going to show up in their sleep, it's going to show up in how they learn and pay attention, and how they manage those big and small emotions. And so when
Mm-hmm.
your kid is struggling in one of those areas, we have to put attention to it. And it doesn't mean it's a clinical issue. It could mean it's a clinical issue. But, as I always say, nobody regrets getting help. They only regret when they don't. So when you
Yeah.
see those alert signals, pay attention. And our kids'
Mm-hmm.
difficulties show up in their behaviors. They're not going to be like, oh, mom, I'm really stressful. Hello, they're in, stressed out. They're in preschool,
Right.
they don't
Right.
have that capacity. My kids talk like that because that's how we talk in our house.
Yeah.
So look for the signs of their behavior. Don't say, oh, maybe it's because of this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, you can say that, but don't try to ignore repeated behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Address them,
Mm-hmm.
and support them and look at it as an opportunity for them to learn, because this is what our kids are doing with us, with our young kids in particular. Every difficulty is an opportunity for them to learn how to regulate, learn how to
Mm.
cope, so that the next time it's easier for them. And some kids need more repetition, and that's okay. And some kids get it once. But
Right.
whatever your kid is out at, be consistent and loving.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how in the beginning you were saying the sort of over parenting and the lack of coping skills as a result. So are you sort of saying, I'm going to give you a little room to feel uncomfortable, be there to support you in those uncomfortable feelings, knowing that, we'll get through this together at the end. And then you can sort of like, it's like you're building your armor or your toolbox, right? Each time you do something like that with your child.
Absolutely, 100%. And
Mhm.
I do a lot of work with coping skills, and for parents that join my Raising Successful Kids community, they get access to all these coping statements. But we want to validate our kids and reinforce them for learning how to cope with things. We want to give them some
Mhm.
room to make mistakes.
Mhm.
And we are only learned through our mistakes. If you keep
Yeah.
telling your kids, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, they're not really learning. They're just parenting. And you don't
Right.
want them to then try to make mistakes when they're 21.
Right.
We want to do it now so that our
Yeah.
kids have their own
Yeah.
experiences. And it really is such a payoff in
Mhm.
so many ways.
Mhm.
And I think we don't value enough common sense. Like, oh, your kid has great common sense and is a good decision maker. We want our kids to be
Mhm.
great decision makers when we're not around.
Yes.
And
So
that is
true.
so important, and it's a conversation that I love to have, because I don't think we
Yeah.
value it as much.
That's so true. I'm just laughing at all the different conversations with my kids, or all these examples I could think of. I don't know if you've heard of this book, The Blessing of a B minus. I think that's the
Yes, and
correct
it's also
title.
like the blessing of the skin knee, right?
Ah,
So it's a
yes.
similar, the first book, like probably 20 years
Hmm.
ago, was this book called Blessing of the Skin Knee, and how we have to
Yep.
let our kids B minus, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I definitely wasn't a
Or
straight A
skin their
student in
knee.
high school. I think
Yeah.
I did okay. So,
Yeah. But
it's true.
it's hard as a parent, right? Because we
Hard.
do get stuck in that, like, well, no, they have to get into this school to,
Right.
even if it's waiting list for preschools,
I
the
mean,
pressure is on.
unbelievable.
I mean, I know I've had clients who literally, I mean, obviously before the pandemic, camped out,
Yeah.
or had to have interviews with their child, young child, to
Right.
get into school. So, some of it we have to recognize. I would imagine you'd say we have to let go ourselves, right,
We
to
do.
allow our child to, quote unquote, what we might think is fail, and know that it's not a reflection upon us as we're not being a good parent, but we're actually helping them to be resilient.
we are helping them to be resilient, and we really want to be there for our kids and help them develop problem solving skills and coping skills, because when big things happen to them as young adults,
Mm-hmm.
we want them to be like, okay, that stunk, but
Right.
I learned this. I'm going
Right.
to do this to get through it, and I'm going to be
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And, we keep forgetting our job is to raise independent kids. It's not to raise a straight A student with no other skills other than
Mm-hmm.
academics. And I think the
Yeah.
pandemic just shined a light on that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
holy moly. Like, I saw that my kid, can't do this, or it is very difficult, to get him to pay attention, and, or whatever was going on. Cause I don't think most kids really of all ages for the most part had some impact. There was some stress, and we
Yeah.
certainly know that 70% of parents, according to the APA Stress in America survey, felt that they had a significant impact on their daily life in terms of stress, with pandemic parenting. And so,
Oh yeah.
that means we have a lot of parents walking around the world who are maxed out and overwhelmed,
Yeah.
and you need to dig deep, and you need to take care of yourself, and you need to be a role model for
Mm-hmm.
self care,
Mm-hmm.
for your kids, because that means when you show your kids that you love yourself, they get that message that they should
Mm-hmm.
love themselves. And if your kids aren't loving themselves, really, you're limiting their success in life. They're not
Yeah.
going to be the rock stars in whatever you have carved out, for them, because you've got to believe in yourself, as corny as that is. If you don't have that inner self esteem and confidence, there is a limit on what your child can achieve,
Mm-hmm.
regardless if they go to
Mm-hmm.
whatever
Mm-hmm.
fancy dancy schmancy school.
Yeah. And I would imagine even if you just said to your child, I'm working on that.
Yeah,
I'm getting better at loving myself. I
yeah.
wasn't so good at it when I was younger, but mommy or daddy is working on it. Because, it's good for our children to see that we're imperfect and
It's
we're working on getting
so
better.
important for parents to see that we're not perfect. I have
Hmm.
daily conversations like, "Oh, I
Hmm.
shouldn't have done that," or "Ooh," and then my kids get to see me or whatever. My little guy's dyslexic, and he's really great about it, and he's a good reader, great reader
Hmm.
now, and it's the writing we're working on. He's only 10. And so sometimes, he gets upset that his tutor in the summertime has to come 4 days a week. And I was like, "Mommies can't do math." And then
Hmm.
he comes in because we're really funny, and he's like,
Hmm.
yeah, like, you can barely even explain what a rhombus is, like, he likes to, we
Right.
really have a joke
Right.
about it, and he gets to
Right.
see where he's a rock star in certain
Yeah.
things, because he
Yeah.
really is a rock star in a lot of things. And yet nobody's perfect, mommy's not perfect, right?
Hmm.
He's like, and those are great conversations. And then just little things like, oh gosh, I shouldn't have done that. Like, yesterday, I swore I got mad at something, and I must have used every expletive in the book in front of him. And later that night, I was like, oh my God, I think I said the F word 5 times in front of you. He's like, I think it was more like 10, you know?
Right.
And I was like, I think I should have used other words. He's like, it's okay, mom. I knew you were really mad about whatever it was. And I was like, well, it's kind of silly for me to get mad about it. And we
Right.
just had like that kind of conversation, and it's just a
Hmm.
really real conversation in the moment. And
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
wasn't swearing at him; it was something else.
Right. Right.
And so sometimes in my head in parenting, if I'm not yelling at my kids, which doesn't happen that often, but I feel like, oh, I'm mad about this other thing. That's really, he's looking at me and is like, how is she managing that frustrating situation? Well,
Hmm.
most of the time, I'm not a
Hmm.
person who gets mad at things. Like, I'm
Hmm.
pretty, I'm teaching my kids, like, forget about that. It's not worth it
Right.
or whatever. So, but disrespectful stuff is my trigger. And I literally would be like, oh, when somebody's disrespectful, I seem to lose it. And then it's just a great
Hmm.
conversation. So use every opportunity as a
Yeah.
learning lesson. You
Yeah.
don't have to hide your errors. I mean, it's
Yeah.
so important, Kim.
Yeah. I have had so many conversations with parents who, again, when we're talking about sleep, who the child's having a hard time, we figure out that there is some anxiety going on. And then I end up asking the parents, like, so do you think you have some anxiety, or did you have anxiety when you were children? Most of the time, the answer is yes. And I asked, did you get any help? And lots of times, but not always, thankfully, they'll say no. And I'll say, well,
Mm-hmm.
so then this is such an opportunity for your child, because I bet you when you were 4 or 5, you wished that you had found, gotten some more resources to help, shut off your mind, go to sleep, what to do with all those worries that come up before, going to bed, about school, about your friends, about whatever it is, the outside world coming in, as I like to say. And so they see it as that opportunity, and then even being able to tell their child, when I was little, I had this and I didn't learn how to do this, and so together we can figure this out, and I'll help you
They
and I'm going to
love
learn
hearing that,
myself.
Kim. They love
Yeah.
hearing when we had a hard time in something and
Yeah.
what we did and didn't do. My kids love to hear stories about that. And it's good. And they listen and it's us and we're not pointing the finger at them. So, that's kids who struggle in some way, there's a shame and there's a defensiveness. And so
Mm-hmm.
through stories, it's a great way to teach and
Yeah.
offer love, loving
Yeah.
guidance.
Yeah. So much for us to talk about. I think we're going to come back and we'll talk more about the pandemic. Love to talk about, technology and that point you made about disconnect, and how important it is for us to not have, I guess, if I am hearing you correctly, not have too much disconnect time.
That's
So
right.
that, yeah. And so how to find that balance that isn't overwhelming for both the child and the parent. So I can't wait to dive into that topic further in our next episode. And in the meantime, everyone who's listening, please go to sleeplady.com/podcast, and you can follow Dr. Roseann on social media, check out her website, pick up a copy of her book, which is amazing. And I'm sure I know actually that you have thousands of amazing blog articles too, and reach out to her at the Global Institute too. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Roseann. I look
Thanks for this
forward.
conversation. As I always tell parents, wherever you are in your parenting journey, it's going to be okay.
Yeah. And we should tell our kids that too.
We totally should tell our kids that.
Tell ourselves, tell our children, tell everybody. Okay, it's going to be okay.
It's going to be okay.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Roseann.